Evening had settled over the forest while Lena stood beside the cabin window. Rain crossed the glass and softened the pines into dark, uneven shapes. A shaded lamp rested on the small table beneath the window. Its light reached the wooden floor and the nearby armchair. Across the room, a low fire moved behind the fireplace screen. Orange light touched the stone hearth, then faded across the plain walls. Lena turned from the window and opened her travel bag on the chair. Only a few things remained inside after her earlier unpacking. She carried a folded shirt to the narrow cupboard beside the bookshelf. Across from the small kitchen, several novels leaned against a green bookend. Her wool socks went into the lower drawer beneath the shirt. She pressed the drawer closed with one hand and heard its wooden runner slide. She lifted the bag and set it beside the cupboard. From there, it did not block the path through the room. The cabin had one main room with clear, useful spaces. The kitchen occupied the back corner under a sloping section of ceiling. A short counter held a sink, kettle, and a blue cup. Two open shelves above it carried bowls, plates, honey, and tea. Near the window, the small table offered room for a book and drink. The armchair faced both the table and the fireplace at an easy angle. A gray blanket lay across one arm of the chair. Its lower edge had slipped and nearly touched the floorboards. Lena picked up that edge and placed it across the seat. She would fold it properly after tending the fire. A closed book with a faded blue cover lay on the table. A thin cream bookmark showed between the pages near the middle. She had chosen the book from the shelf before unpacking. Its cover showed a small house above a pale line of sea. Rain gathered in winding trails on the outer window pane. Some drops joined and moved downward, briefly clearing narrow paths through the glass. Beyond those paths, pine branches bent under the passing water. Their outlines appeared sharper for a moment, then blurred again. The roof gave the rain a broader, lower sound. Near the window, separate drops tapped against the metal gutter outside. The cleared chair now seemed ready for the rest of the evening. She moved the bag a little closer to the wall. Lamplight rested on the table while firelight changed around it. The two kinds of light met across the chair and floor. A small clock stood on the bookshelf below the top row. Its hands had moved past the hour, though Lena did not study them. She looked toward the kitchen and noticed the kettle by the sink. Its curved handle cast a dark shape across the counter. The blue cup stood upside down on a folded drying cloth. Beside it, a clean spoon reflected a narrow line from the lamp. For a little while, she watched rain pass through the lamp's reflection. The glass held both the indoor circle of light and the moving forest. A log in the fireplace shifted slightly and released a brief red glow. The flames lowered around its darkened edge without going out. Lena stepped closer and looked through the simple mesh screen. The fire was ready for another log. Before returning to the hearth, Lena went to the small kitchen. She lifted the metal kettle from its place beside the sink. Cold water ran in a narrow stream and struck the kettle's bottom. She filled it enough for 1 cup, then turned the tap off. The stove stood at the end of the short counter. Lena set the kettle on the smaller ring and chose a low heat. She left the kitchen and crossed the open floor towards the fireplace. The indoor wood basket stood beside the stone hearth. Lena selected 2 pieces from the top and carried them together. She placed one on the hearth and kept the other in her hands. After moving the screen aside, she used the iron poker to nudge the older logs toward the center. A small gap opened between them, revealing the red coals below. She drew the poker back and returned it to the iron stand. The coals glowed evenly beneath the wood. She set the new log across the older pieces. The dry wood rested securely, supported at both ends. Lena returned the screen to its place before adding anything else. She watched through the mesh while the flame widened. The second piece went into the basket's open space for later. She turned its cut end outward, matching the pieces below. A little gray ash lay on the stone in front of the fire. Lena took a small brush from a hook nearby. She brushed the ash into a small metal pan. The dark stone showed clearly again. She emptied the pan into a metal ash box beside the wood basket. Then she closed its lid and returned the brush and pan to their hooks. The new log had caught evenly by then. Flames moved along its lower edge and around one shallow crack. Its brighter light reached the legs of the armchair. It also brought out the reddish grain in the window table. Lena walked to the chair and lifted the gray blanket. The wool opened with a faint, dry rustle between her hands. She opened it over the chair and brought its corners together. After one more fold, she laid it across the chair's right arm. Firelight touched the gray folds along the chair arm. One end remained easy to pull over her knees later. Lena sat for a moment and looked across the room in the stronger firelight. The green bookend cast a longer shadow across the middle shelf. Rain continued over the roof with a broad, even pattern. At the gutter, quicker drops formed a lighter line of sound. Lena rose and set the iron tool straighter in its stand. She also moved the wood basket closer to the wall by one handspan. These small changes left more open space between the chair and hearth. She crossed it and returned to the table. The closed book remained where she had left it. Its blue cover now held a bright stripe from the renewed fire. She touched the lamp's base and turned it slightly toward the chair. The shade directed more light across the tabletop. Behind her, the kettle made its first low sound in the kitchen. The quiet murmur gathered beneath its fitted lid. Lena crossed to the kitchen when the kettle began to murmur. The sound stayed low and steady over the small stove ring. She took the blue cup from the drying cloth and turned it upright. Its glaze was darker near the base and lighter around the rim. A jar of chamomile stood on the lower open shelf. Beside it sat the honey in a round glass jar. She measured the dried flowers into a simple metal strainer. Small yellow centers and pale leaves settled within the fine mesh. The strainer fit across the top of the cup. Lena moved the cup closer to the kettle, keeping its handle toward her. Steam rose when she lifted the kettle from the stove. She poured until the cup was nearly full. She set the kettle on a cork mat beside the stove. Its metal sides gave one faint sound as they began to cool. Steam clouded the lower kitchen window above the sink. Beyond the glass, water left the roof in steady drops. After several minutes, she lifted the strainer and held it above the cup. The last drops passed through before she set it in a bowl. She added a small spoonful of honey to the tea. Lena stirred until it disappeared. She raised the cup and noticed the light scent of the flowers. Only a thin line of steam rose now. One careful sip tested the temperature. She set the cup down and carried the used strainer to the sink. She emptied the wet flowers into a small bin beneath the sink. Then she washed the bowl, strainer, and spoon. She placed all 3 items on the drying cloth. The spoon lay beside the clear space where the cup had stood. A small drop of tea remained near the cup's base. Lena wiped it away before lifting the cup by its handle. Outside, the rain continued over the roof and along the gutter. Lena lifted the cup and left the small kitchen. She crossed the wooden floor toward the chair. A light scent rose with the steam above the cup. At the table, firelight moved under the lamp's wider circle. The closed book lay near the center, with its spine toward the chair. She placed the cup to the right of the book. Enough space remained between them for her hand and the turning pages. A faint ring of steam rose above the blue rim. It passed through the lamplight and thinned before reaching the shade. Lena sat in the armchair and drew the table slightly closer. Its legs moved only a few centimeters across the floor. From this position, she could reach both the cup and book. The folded gray blanket rested along the chair's right arm. She took another sip and looked across the blue cover. The pale house and line of sea were clear under the lamp. The fire gave a brief crackle as the new log settled. Behind the mesh, the flame held an even shape along the darkening wood. Lena set the cup beside the closed book. Then she drew the lamp slightly nearer. The lamp moved easily across the smooth part of the table. Lena stopped it where light covered the book without shining against the window. She turned the shade a little toward the chair. The blue cup remained at the right edge of the light. After opening the book, she found the cream bookmark near the middle. She laid it flat beside the lamp's round base. The story followed a family living near the sea. Their house stood above a harbor with a road passing behind it. Rain marked the window with separate taps and narrow streams. Lena kept reading while the sound gathered around the cabin. The page made a light sound as Lena turned it. Then rain and fire filled the room again. She paused at the end of the page and lifted the blue cup. The tea was now cool enough for a longer drink. A log gave one brief crack as it settled in the hearth. Lena looked up for a moment, then returned to the page. She turned the page and set the cup beside the book. The handle pointed toward her at the edge of the lamplight. The lamp held its steady circle across the paper. Firelight moved beyond it, reaching the table legs and chair arm. As minutes passed, the stronger orange light began to lower. The new log kept burning, but its bright edge had moved inward. Lena read another section about the harbor road. The family stopped at a shop to choose fruit for the next morning. Outside the shop, a bicycle leaned beside the door. The harbor road curved past two low houses before reaching the water. A heavier run of rain crossed the roof for a short time. The gutter answered with quicker metal notes near the window. Lena did not move the book during that passing change. She finished the paragraph, then looked toward the dark glass. The lamp's reflection covered part of the forest view. Around its edge, pine trunks appeared as broad vertical shapes. Drops crossed those shapes and gathered along the lower frame. The water made a thin line there before draining outside. She looked back at the open pages. Their pale surface seemed brighter after the window's darker view. Another page carried a small drawing of the harbor. A narrow pier extended from the shore, with 3 boats beside it. Lena studied the drawing, then continued to the next page. The family had returned home before the evening tide. After another drink, only a little tea remained. The chamomile left a mild taste of honey. The book rested comfortably across her hands. Its spine opened fully, so she did not need to hold the pages down. At the hearth, the tall flame became two shorter flames. Their light traveled less widely across the bookshelf now. The lamp therefore gave clearer light around the chair. Its shade left the upper shelves in a pleasant round shadow. Lena reached a natural break and paused with one finger under the final line. Rain ticked against the window and flowed over the roof. As she lifted the next few pages, a cream edge appeared near the binding. A loose note was tucked farther ahead in the book. Lana held the open book steady and looked at the cream edge. It belonged to a folded piece of ordinary writing paper. She lifted it by one corner without pulling the later pages. The note came free and opened along a softened fold. The sharp lines filled the upper half in dark pencil. Lena now recognized the Nera letters as her own handwriting. The first line mentioned pine needles after rain. The second recorded the lake's deep green color under a cloudy morning. The final line noted bread cooling on the wooden table. There was no date, title, or name beneath the observations. She remembered one autumn morning when wet pine needles covered the path beside the cabin. The lake looked green through the kitchen window, and a small loaf cooled near the honey jar. The paper had softened along the fold, and one corner was lightly creased. A faint pencil mark crossed the lower edge beneath the final line. Lena let the brief memory pass and lowered the note. The blue cup stood beside her hand on the table. Rain moved across the main window in fine, slanted lines. It continued over the roof and along the metal gutter. Lena placed the note on the table and smoothed its fold. Her palm moved from the center toward one edge, then the other. The paper lay flat beside the cream bookmark. Pencil marks varied slightly, where she had pressed harder on several words. She read the 3 lines once more without adding anything. Then she folded the lower half upward along the same crease. The note fit neatly between the later pages. Lena slid it back until only a small cream edge remained visible. She returned to the page she had been reading. Her finger found the final line beside the page number. The family in the book had reached their house above the harbor. Their folded map was back on the kitchen table. Lena finished the current page at an unhurried pace. The last paragraph described fruit set in a plain white bowl. She placed the cream bookmark between the finished page and the next. Its upper edge showed above the faded blue cover. Before closing the book, she checked that the note remained farther ahead. the slim paper stayed level near the binding. She closed the cover and set the book under the lamp. The pale house above the sea returned to view. Her tea was now only a little warm. She lifted the blue cup and finished what remained. The tea left a mild sweetness after the final drink. The bottom of the cup was clear when she lowered it. She held the blue cup while rain traced the window. The fire gave a low crackle behind its mesh screen. Then she set the blue cup beside the closed book. From the chair, she looked toward the low fire and the rain-darkened window. By the time Lena finished her tea, the rain had grown lighter. It still crossed the window and moved along the roof edge. At the fireplace, the log had settled into a low red glow. Two small flames remained near the center behind the screen. Lena set the book near the middle of the table. The bookmark showed at the top, while the note stayed farther ahead. She took the used blue cup and stood from the chair. The gray blanket remained folded across the right arm. In the kitchen, she placed the cup beneath the tap. A short stream of water cleared the last trace of tea. She turned the cup once and rinsed around its lighter rim. Then she shook off the drops above the sink. She placed the blue cup upside down beside the clean spoon and strainer. Its round base caught a small reflection from the lamp. The kettle had cooled on the cork mat beside the stove. She lifted it and poured the remaining water into the sink. After one quick rinse, she returned it to its usual place. The curved handle faced outward above the dry counter. The lamp held a wider circle across the chair and table. Its reflection floated on the window over the dark pine shapes. Lena crossed the floor and stood beside the lamp. She turned the control until the light became dimmer. The smaller circle still covered the chair, book, and table edge. Beyond it, the floorboards changed from gold to brown. She looked toward the fireplace through the screen. The red coals rested beneath the dark center of the log. She sat again and lifted the gray blanket from the chair arm. Its two folds opened across her knees and lower legs. The wool covered her without reaching the floor. One corner rested beside her hand on the broad chair arm. The closed book lay within reach, though she did not reopen it. Its faded cover looked gray-blue in the lower lamplight. Rain tapped the main window with more space between drops. Across the roof, the earlier broad sound had become a thinner layer. Lena rested her hands over the blanket. From the chair, she could also see the kitchen counter and blue cup. The cup stood upside down on the drying cloth. The kettle waited near the sink, its metal surface now dark. At the hearth, one small flame disappeared into the coals. The other stayed low beside a narrow red line. Its changing light no longer reached the bookshelf. The lamp now showed the clock, green bookend, and lower row of books. Later, Lena adjusted the blanket around her ankles. From the chair, she could see both the table and the fireplace. Outside the window, rain moved through the lamp's reflection. The dark pines became clearer whenever a trail crossed the glass. Drops gathered along the lower frame and slipped from view. On a branch near the roof, a few separate drops remained. Lena stayed in the chair as the evening deepened. On the table beside her, the lowered lamp lit the closed blue book. Fine rain crossed the window and caught the light in brief silver lines. Beyond the lamp's small circle, the pine trees stood dark against the night.